deep in prayer. I'm just waiting for it to turn 9:10 so that we don't, people are joining us online. We're not getting a too early a start here. Good morning. Thanks again for being here this morning, and I want to say hello to anybody who might be joining us online this morning, either live right now or later in the week. We're so glad that you're able to do that. And if you would like to participate this morning during this session, please just feel free to write a little message in the chat box on YouTube, and we would be happy to include your comments, your questions, your observations in our conversation this morning. This is the third of and final session of this three-part series. The Advent of Hope at the Table of God is what it is organized under. And just as a review of what the purpose of this has been, first, to place our life here in this parish in the wider context of what's happening in the world around us, especially concerning religion and the deep suspicion of religion that gets deeper by the day, it would appear. And so to try to take notice of that suspicion and how we might address it constructively, and more particularly to put our Eucharistic life, what we do around this table up here, the Eucharistic table, what is that? What is our worship around this table in relationship to that suspicion of religion? That's one of the connections I've been inviting us to think about. We are engaged in this religious activity. What does it mean for a world that is suspicious of religion? And then to create a sense, a deeper awareness, if you will, of why the Eucharist might be so central to Christian traditions, and why that's the focus of our attention, that table, when we enter this space. So I don't have a PowerPoint for us this morning. I just want us to have some conversation. I'll make some observations, and we'll see. And I also want to talk a little bit about what do I want to call them? Policies and procedures sounds too bureaucratic, but our approach here in this parish to the table. Every church has a sense or a set of guidelines, procedures, policies around communion and around participation in worship. I wanted to say a little bit about that concerning our own parish and our own life together, and get your thoughts about that. So just as a quick review, and it doesn't have to be quick, we'll see where you are with it. Religion. You might recall, we spent a little bit of time on our very first week talking about what's your experience with religion? What is religion? And one of the things I suggested is it's actually hard to figure out where that word came from. There are two Latin verbs that most scholars think got mushed together to form our word religion. One is religare, which means to reread. The idea is that you're passing something on. When you reread it, you pass it along to somebody or to a group. So there's a sense of something being passed down, reread over generations. There's another similar sounding verb, religare, which means to bind together. And it's the ligament. I was looking at the orthopedic surgeon sitting in the room about ligaments. So the idea about binding together in religare is just like ligaments keep our bones together in a skeleton. Otherwise, our bones would just be a heap on the floor, right? So there's a sense in which something is binding things together. So if you put those two verbs together, religare and religare, you get this sense of being bound together in a community by what's being passed down from generation to generation. Texts, traditions, practices, insights, ideas. I find that useful to remember those two Latin verbs that become our word religion. I also offered some insights from Catherine Albanese, who's a scholar of American religion. I really found her book years ago when I read it, called America, to be very useful. Because one of the things that she notes in that book is religion is almost impossible to define. So what she says instead is, let's just describe it. What's it like to encounter a religious tradition or a religious community? She proposed there were 4 component parts to every religious tradition. One, and I love it because it's all C words, right? So I love alliteration that helps us to remember things. So the first component is creed. That, by the way, comes from the Latin verb credo. It means I believe. So creed has to do with belief. What do you believe about the world, about reality? Anything about it. That there's such a thing called gravity. There are trees. There's air. We have responsibilities. Whatever it is you believe about reality and how it works, that's your creed. Based on the creed, there's a code. There's a code of behavior. So because we believe in gravity, we don't step off a cliff because we know we'll fall, right? There's a direct connection between what we believe about the world and how we live. And then this weird word that some people get tripped up by, cultist. That word just means ritual. So you have sort of ritualized behaviors that help to instill in us the creed and the code. And then all of that creates a community. So creed, code, cultus, community. That's every religious tradition, Catherine Albanese says. Notice, this is something that really got my attention when I first encountered this. There's no mention of God in that definition or that description of religion. That's because she says you don't have to have any sense of divinity to have a religious tradition. That's not the essence of religion necessarily. Religion is instead what you believe about the world, how you live, how you ritualize that, and how that forms a community. Thus, she says, we can talk about patriotism as a form of religion. Here in the United States, there are certain things we believe about the birth of democracy, how we're supposed to live as citizens in a free democracy. We ritualize this. We ritualize it with a flag, with a pledge of allegiance, with, by the way, you probably know this, Washington, D.C. was designed to mimic on a large scale, a religious location. So the monuments in Washington, D.C. are really designed like shrines from basically ancient Greek architecture and temples. So there's a sense in which we believe certain things about the country, we visualize at least ideally or can have religion without God. And one of the things that also got my attention from Catherine Albanese is nobody lives without religion. Everybody. You might live without gods, but you don't live without religion. Religion is this way that, and your religion could be like Marilyn and I could get together and say, we're going to start our own little religious tradition. We're going to believe this about the world, behave this way, ritualize it, and we've created a community. So what's useful to me about that is to be able to ask certain questions about what people believe. Why are you acting this way? How do you ritualize this in your life or among your friends and in your community? And then to bring it into what we do here in this religious space. What is it that we believe? Every single Sunday we do something called a creed that's derived from the 4th century Council of Nicaea that tells us certain things, at least back in the 4th century, about what Christians believed about the world, about reality. And then how that shapes how we live. We ritualize it around this table, and it creates a sense of community. So let me pause there for a moment and see what you think about that. We talked a little bit about it on the first week. But I wonder if it illuminates things for you, if it's insightful for you, if you have questions about it, or how it relates to our life here in the parish. I'll just pause and see what you think.
About everybody is religious. Intriguing one and kind of handy because I have had people, friends, say, I am not religious. And so you can sort of maybe talk about that a little bit so that they're aware that they're not just opting out of something, but they too are living their life with religion. Like, recognize it.
I really appreciate that. I meant to go that direction as well. It can be useful when people say, it's very common these days to hear, I'm spiritual, but I'm really not religious. To which I sometimes will say, if people are interested in engaging in conversation, you're probably much more religious than you think. Let's talk about what you believe about the world and just go through those 4 C's, right? The other reason it's useful is to invite people into their own place of introspection. The reason I find those 4 C's helpful is it can sometimes help us examine what goes unnoticed in our lives. Oh, why am I behaving this way? I must believe something about reality that's shaping my behavior. Or, another way to put it is, if I really do believe this about reality, why am I not living in such a way that reflects that? What's the gap? And one of the reasons I think doing Eucharist every single week is so paramount is because of what I would call I call it different things depending on what I'm thinking at the moment, but it's kind of like a counter-cultural formation. So around in our society, we are being formed every single day to think certain ways. Through advertising, through television, through magazines, through newspapers, through billboards, through our conversations, how stores set up their shelves full of stuff. We're being formed to think certain ways and act certain ways. They're not all healthy. They're not all helpful. And in fact, a lot of them are now destroying the planet. as we know. So how do we resist that formation? How do we form ourselves differently? I would say, as a Christian community, we do that around this table. We form ourselves not as acquisitive people, but as people who give ourselves away, for example. If we believe that at this table God gives God's self to us in the form of bread and wine, for example, that shapes us as people who give ourselves away to others for the sake of love and life and health and wholeness. Anything else about religion? I'll keep pointing at the camera in case anybody online would like to jump in. You're always free to do that. As I always like to say, there's no statute of limitations on conversations, so if something occurs to you as we move on about that, feel free to toss it into the mix. Last week I suggested some things about the Eucharist itself and its origins in first century table fellowship, and that Jesus was constantly getting into trouble for eating with the wrong people. And I suggested some of the rules of first century meal sharing that he broke, and that this was a primary strategy on the part of Jesus and then the gospel writers to present a different view of God. So if everybody, in shorthand version, if everybody's welcome to the table, what kind of God is that who just welcomes everybody? Almost indiscriminately. What kind of grace is that? What kind of love is that? What kind of hospitality is that? How then should we live if God who welcomes us to the table? Before I say anything more about our own practices here, any thoughts about first century table fellowship? This little book, which I encouraged folks to read if you had a chance. I meant to put this out last week, but this is a wonderful little book called Soul Banquets by John Koenig, who's an Episcopal priest. The subtitle of the book is How Meals Become Mission in the Local Congregation. And at some point, it would be really great if this parish could sit down and just do a book study together of this short little book, because it's really a useful way of thinking about what difference might the Eucharistic table make in the way we understand who we are in this wider world and right here in this shoreline region. Let me give you just a little flavor, if that's okay, just for a second, about what he's doing here. So he says, this will all sound familiar, so you'll realize I'm showing my cards. I didn't get all of this just out of my own head. It actually comes from somewhere. Meals, he says, this is in his introduction, meals have occupied a central place in Christian faith and practice from the very beginning. Meals and meal sharing. It's now common knowledge, I love this next phrase, he says, it's now common knowledge, for example, that Jesus loved to eat and drink. I love that image of Jesus, you know, that we have such a ritualized way of reading the gospel accounts on Sunday mornings in worship, in a big book that has gold on it, and you know, Francis comes down with great ceremony here, and we'll read it this morning. And we forget this is a real human being, Jesus, fully human, who, as John Koenig is saying here, really loved dinner parties, really loved gathering at the table, and insisted that everybody is welcome to the table. And then he goes on to say, Koenig goes on to say, yeah, sure, Francis.
I was just thinking that back in early Christianity, their houses were and probably not conducive to large gatherings, perhaps. So I envisioned them outside, perhaps under a tent, kind of like we did in the summer. And to me, that enables Jesus sitting there, someone's going by, and you can just imagine, have some bread. Let's talk. It gives a very humanistic or very human side of Jesus.
Thank you, Francis. That reminds me, and forgive me if I've already shared this before, but it's worth repeating, I think. When I was teaching in Berkeley, the location of that cluster of schools and seminaries in Berkeley, right there on the West Coast, made it a very attractive place for people in the Pacific Basin to come there for study. So we had lots of Korean students, for example, but we also had lots of South Pacific Islanders who would come and study with us. And what was really great about that is learning from these different cultures and cultural perspectives about Christian faith practice. And the reason this came to mind with that, Francis, is because certainly in Samoa and American Samoa, South Pacific Island nation, this was true. I learned from the students who came from there. Because of the tropical, almost year-round tropical weather, many of their houses are just open. So not closed, we live here in the northern hemisphere where there's snow and weather, and so we have closed-in spaces. But in Samoa, there are many houses that are just open-walled, at least on 3 sides, if not all. And one of the things they would say is it's just the expectation. When you sit down for dinner with your family and some friends, if somebody's walking by, you're supposed to invite them in for food. So it's a cultural reality that's rooted in hospitality around the table. And as Koenig says, Jesus, in this kind of table fellowship that he practiced, thought he was, why did he do that? Koenig said because he thought he was extending the welcome of God's reign to all who dined with him, especially those on the margins of society. And then Koenig also notes, whenever you see stories or parables about food or banquets, it's about the Eucharist in the Gospels. And one of the primary places of this John's Gospel, really interestingly, John's account of the Gospel does not have a Last Supper narrative where Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood." In John's account of the Gospel at the Last Supper, Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. So people have been like, well, is there no Eucharist then in John's Gospel? No, says several prominent Bible scholars. Actually, every story in John's Gospel is about the Eucharist. And the primary story of the Eucharist in John's account of the Gospel is the feeding of the 5,000. As Koenig says, the reason for that is because Jesus wanted, above all, for the image of abundance to be the image of God's coming realm. The feeding of the 5,000 is, here's a little bit of food, it's going to feed 5,000 people. He also has some really great sections in this book about why meals? Is it just because Jesus loved dinner parties? He says, well, that's part of it, but the other part of it is when we are sitting down at a table with friends and strangers and eating together, it touches a deep place in us, he says, of comfort, of fellowship, of intimacy, because food is what actually enables our survival as a species. And so food becomes this place of deep connection.
Take you up on your fact that we could go back. Last week, we described some of our memories. Did the Thanksgiving dinner at Palo Alto, but just now it came up in my thinking that when you first got here, we had that large table gathering out here. They're a friend of yours.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I forget what the...
It was my birthday.
Oh, okay. It was this vast gathering of some people I knew and some people I've never met. Some people from local, some people
From a long way away, yep. And we told stories, remember that? So the... Yes. So I don't want to belabor this, and I want to make sure to get into a couple of things about how we do this here at All Saints. There we go. One of the things that got Jesus into so much trouble, and this is what Koenig is referring to in terms of the margins of society, just to put some more particularity on that image that he's talking about. Part of what got Jesus into so much trouble, there were many things, but one of them was he didn't have any preconditions for who came to the table. And there are several stories that are leap to mind. Maybe you can think of others too. But there's a wonderful story in Luke's account of the gospel of Zacchaeus. You remember Zacchaeus? He was a tax collector. This is something really important to remember about first century Palestine. Tax collectors, I mean, I don't know, does anybody have any friends who work for the IRS? No. Do you want any friends who work for the IRS? Tax collection is not exactly what you want to sign up for if you want to be a favorite kind of person in town, right? And even more so in first century Palestine, because most of the tax collectors in first century Palestine were Jews who were collecting taxes for Rome. And not only were they collecting taxes for the occupying empire, they were skimming money off the top for themselves. So they would be charging you extra, the tax. This is what made them so despised. Tax collectors and sinners, right? Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners is the phrase throughout the gospel accounts. because they were considered traitors, not trustworthy, and to be kept at a distance, and religiously unclean because they dealt with the empire. So Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and he was apparently very short. That Jesus came to town, and big crowds is walking down the road. So Zacchaeus climbs the tree. Remember this? It's like I remember the story so vividly as a kid. A great visual. Zacchaeus climbs the sycamore tree. He can see Jesus in the middle of this crowd coming down, and then Jesus, they're passing the tree, and Jesus, Zacchaeus calls out to see. It's just a wonderful story. Jesus says, Zacchaeus, come down out of that tree. I'm going to eat at your house tonight for dinner. What's really important to notice about this story is that Zacchaeus didn't do or say anything to earn the presence of Jesus in his home. Now later, at the dinner, Zacchaeus says, I'm going to repay everybody that I stole money from, and I'm going to give half again as more back. He's got this big generosity of spirit while he's at the party with Jesus. But he doesn't say that before Jesus says, I'm coming to your house for dinner. There's no precondition that Jesus sets for sharing meals. It's really, y'all come. This is also true, by the way, for Matthew. Matthew was also a tax collector, the one who we attribute to being the gospel writer in the canon of the New Testament, Matthew's account of the gospel. Same thing, Jesus calls him from the tax booth. Do you remember that, right? So Jesus is going by the tax collection booth and basically says, hey, Matthew, come follow me. And Matthew says, oh, okay. And then Jesus says, I'm going to eat at your house tonight. Again, with no preconditions set. So let me fast forward here for a second, and then we'll have some conversation, because we're going to run out of time very quickly. Here are some things. When I first arrived, so it's the three things I want to mention. I'll do these quickly, and I'd love to get your thoughts on them. It's called open table, so I want to say what that means. Open space, and I had the thing was open hands. So again, I love alliteration. So open table, open space, open hands. Oh, Freddie. There is, among some churches, including here at this parish, a practice called open table, which means, as I say, every single time that we have Eucharist, I try to make sure that I've got it in my notes so that I remember to say it, that everybody, without exception, is welcome to come and receive communion at this table. The much more specific implication there is that you don't need, I'll sometimes say this, you don't need a passport, you don't need a driver's license, you don't need a birth certificate, you don't need anything. You don't even need a baptismal. You don't even have to be baptized. This is what gets people like me in trouble, because in the official position of the church is still that you should be a baptized Christian before you receive communion. I understand the theological and liturgical logic of that chronology. It makes sense to me. But we're living at a time with a deep suspicion of religion and the institutional church. Anytime we put up more barriers and more obstacles for people to be in communion with God and each other, we are closing doors in a way that is not helpful in a society that's deeply suspicious of religion. And so when I first arrived as the rector here 3.5 years ago, one of the first things I did at a vestry meeting, which was on Zoom, was present this notion of the open table, to say that my intention is to make this table here open with no preconditions, that everybody is Zacchaeus, everybody is Matthew, everybody is welcome, no preconditions. And I wanted the vestry to vote on it so that we could have it as a parish policy. And they voted unanimously to affirm that approach. Canonically speaking, that's not appropriate to do, but I think pastorally and in our society today, it's very much the appropriate thing to do. So the practice of open table. And I will tell you, there are, anecdotally anyway, a good number of stories out there of how people, when they encounter the practice of an open table parish, and they're not, or they're moved by it, that over time they say, you know what, I've never been baptized, but now I want to be. I want to participate in a place that expresses this kind of hospitality. I encountered this very thing at my little congregation in Berkeley, California. Dear woman who had never been baptized and was not receiving communion, even though we made it clear every Sunday, we said, you are welcome. Everybody here is welcome to receive, but she wouldn't. And because she didn't believe it. And finally she believed it this one Sunday, and she came forward. She had tears streaming down her face when she received communion. And after that morning she said, I want to be baptized. So even though there's a logic to let's initiate you into the body of Christ first and then feed you with the Eucharist, yes, I get it. Makes sense. However, it doesn't always work that way for people. And for some people, being welcomed to the table first is what compels them to be a fuller member of the community. Open table. Open space. What I mean by open space is related to open table. There's an altar rail here at this Eucharistic table, and it's lovely, and I love the cushions that Arthur Frederick coordinated in making, all beautiful. And the altar rail is mostly for the sake of kneeling when people want to kneel for receiving communion. One of the problems, however, with that image is that it looks like a fence. And the irony, if you want to put it that way, of the Jesus who said, everybody come, everybody's welcome. This is an open table. And then to put a fence between people and the table can give a counter message to that profound gospel truth about God's hospitality. Which is why you may have heard me say in the last couple of weeks, even though we started the practice of Francis and I coming down here with the sacrament because of COVID, the happy accident of that has been the wonderful, I think, theological, spiritual image of the sacrament, of God coming to everybody. God comes to us with God's own life. To me, it's a wonderful visual of the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus tells that story. And the prodigal son is returning. We all know the story, but let's not forget. Before the prodigal son ever says, I'm sorry, before the prodigal son ever says, I've come back home to stay, the father is running down the road to meet him and to embrace him. It's an embrace of grace and love and hospitality and welcome with no condition. Again, it's the Zacchaeus and Matthew stories. So I love that image of God coming down to meet. And then the third one that I'll say, and then we're going to have to wrap this up, is open hands. Thank you. To receive, what is it that we're receiving with our open hands? It's a wafer, but eventually I would love for us a couple of seasons during the year to have what we would call real bread. To underscore what it is that we're receiving. There's a funny little saying that I heard many years ago with the wafers, which I like. They're very convenient to use. They're unleavened. There's all sorts of reasons that the wafers are great. However, as one person said I heard many years ago, sometimes it takes more faith to believe that the wafer is bread than to believe it's the body of Christ. So I would at least a couple of seasons during the church year like to be able to say, in our open hands, let's actually receive bread that is recognizably bread. So we'll try it. It comes with its own set of challenges, but I think it would be useful. So because we've got lots of guests who are going to be coming, I wanted to end it there, but without giving you a chance to say something or ask questions or make observations about especially open table, open space, open hands.
My question really relates to the transfer of the elements. Bread, do you do giving of the element or receiving the element?
Say a little bit more about.
Okay, as an example,
Yep.
right? I've certainly been part of a congregation where those who were approaching the pastor or the elder or whatever would be taking bread from the loaf. My question has to do with sort of that visual of a loaf. Do you see the giver of the elder or the priest or the pastor taking a portion of the bread, handing it to the parishioner, or is it the parishioner taking from the common loaf?
Great question. The short answer, and I'm going to think more about it, is it's the combination. So the Jesus took bread, broke, and gave, and then received. So like it's the whole transaction. I don't like that word, but do you know what I mean? The whole movement.
Right, it's the transmittal of the bread.
Right. So but I really like that question, and I'm going to think more about it.
And a third alternative is of the parishioner, the receiver, actually taking from the loaf rather than it being given.
Given, that's right. I have to think about that now. Yours is still on. Anything else before we wrap up our time this morning? Oh, hey, good morning, Sander. Well, thank you very, very much, friends. We will be returning to these topics, multiple times. And I'm just so glad that you were able to be part of this little series. And also, all of you who are joining us online, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Hey. Hi, Linda. May I give you a hug? Sure. Oh. How are you? I'm so happy to meet you in person.